The Vorethi flagship Sovereign of Nine Suns dropped out of fold space at the edge of Earth's solar system at 04:17 GMT on a Tuesday morning, and the universe held its breath. Commander Vextal Wren stood on the obsidian command deck, his four-fingered hand resting on the ceremonial blade passed down through 23 generations of conquerors. Below him, holographic charts displayed the blue-green world spinning innocently on its axis, oblivious to the 800 warships now eclipsing its moon. Atmospheric composition, nitrogen-oxygen. Sapient population, approximately 9 billion bipeds, technological tier 7. The tactical officer's mandibles clicked dismissively. Pre-stellar, they have not yet achieved full drive. 2 of their satellites have detected us, but their communication networks suggest they believe we are an asteroid swarm. Vextal allowed himself a low, rumbling laugh. In 9,000 years, the coalition had subjugated 412 worlds. The pattern was always the same: arrive in overwhelming force, demolish 3 or 4 major population centers, and accept the surrender of whatever planetary government remained. The conquered species would mine, harvest, and serve. Within a generation, they would forget they had ever been free. Agricultural vermin, he murmured, watching humanity's tiny silver satellites drift past the viewport, and yet they look at the stars. His second-in-command, Karzan Vale, approached with the deference of a warrior who had served under Vextal at the siege of Heliox. "Commander, the Council requests we transmit the standard declaration before commencing the harvest." Vextal waved a dismissive claw. "Save the diplomatic theater for species that matter. These creatures haven't even left their own gravity well in any meaningful capacity. They will not understand the language of empire. They will only understand the language of fire." He turned to the firing officer. "Begin the bombardment. Primary targets, their largest population centers. I want their world's lights extinguished by sundown. Then we will collect what survives." The order propagated through the fleet in seconds. Plasma cannons, weapons forged from the corpses of dying stars, rotated into firing position. 800 warships drew breath together. On Earth, in a tiny apartment in Buenos Aires, a 6-year-old girl named Sophia was eating her breakfast when the sky turned white. In a NORAD bunker beneath Cheyenne Mountain, General Patricia Hale, 43 years old, two-tour in Afghanistan, mother of 2, watched her screens fill with red. She had 37 seconds to decide what to say to her president, who was already screaming into a phone that no longer connected to anything. In Lagos, a fisherman named Tund looked up from his nets and saw a second son being born above the city. It hung there for an eternity. Then the city was gone. Then the sound arrived, a sound that would never leave the survivors, a sound like the universe itself being torn open. By dusk, 11 major cities no longer existed. 400 million human beings had ceased to be. The plasma columns left scars visible from orbit, glowing rings where civilization had stood that morning. On the Sovereign of Nine Suns, Vextal Wren reviewed the orbital footage with quiet satisfaction. The pattern was holding. The vermin were panicking, fleeing, broadcasting desperate pleas on every frequency. Soon, the largest of their nation-states would offer terms of surrender, and the harvest would begin in earnest. Karzan Vale, however, was frowning at a tactical display. "Commander, something is unusual." The communications, we expected pleas for mercy, negotiation attempts, religious broadcasts. Karzan's voice carried the faintest tremor. "We are not receiving any of those." Vextal turned slowly. "Then what are they broadcasting?" The lieutenant hesitated. He was a veteran of 41 campaigns. He had heard the death songs of 100 species. He did not, in that moment, know how to describe what was filling Earth's airwaves. "Names, Commander, they are broadcasting names. Lists of names, in every language, on every channel, hour after hour." "Names of whom?" Karzan looked up, and his pupils had narrowed to slits. "The dead, Commander. They are reading the names of their dead, and they are not stopping." Vextal Wren felt, for the first time in 900 years, a sensation he could not quite identify. It would be 3 weeks before he learned its name. The fires of the 11 cities burned for 9 days. In what remained of Mumbai, a 26-year-old medical resident named Priya Kapoor pulled a 6-year-old boy from beneath a collapsed metro station on the 3rd day. His parents were not with him. His parents would never be with him again. He did not cry. He simply looked up at her with eyes that had aged 40 years overnight and asked, in a voice as flat as scorched glass, "How do we kill them?" Priya did not know how to answer, so she held him and she carried him north, away from the glowing crater that had been her home, and she made a promise she did not yet know how to keep. Across the planet, a strange thing was happening, a thing the Vorethi did not see because they had never thought to look for it. Humans were not breaking. They were organizing. In a server farm in Iceland, a coalition of programmers, Russian, American, Chinese, Israeli, Iranian, who would have been at one another's throats 2 weeks earlier, began stitching together a global mesh network from the ruins of the internet. They worked in silence. They worked without sleep. When one of them collapsed at her keyboard from exhaustion, the others moved her gently to a cot and took over her station mid-keystroke. In the mountains of Colorado, General Patricia Hale walked out of the Cheyenne bunker on the 7th day with 140 surviving officers behind her. She had not spoken to her son in 6 days. Her son was in Tokyo. Her son was no longer anywhere. She stood on the cracked tarmac, looked up at the scarred sky, and said only one sentence to the assembled command. "Find me their supply lines." In orbit, Commander Vextel Wren was beginning to feel a vague, persistent unease. The surrender had not come. By every coalition projection, by every model refined across 10,000 years of conquest, the dominant human governments should have been transmitting capitulation signals within 72 hours of the initial bombardment. Species responded to overwhelming force in predictable patterns: despair, bargaining, submission. Earth was not following the pattern. Instead, Earth had gone quiet. The frantic, panicked broadcasts of the first day had slowed, then ceased. The reading of the names continued, but only on certain channels, reverent, ritualistic, a chorus that never stopped and never broke. Beyond that, the airwaves were dark. "They are coordinating without using broadcast frequencies," reported the intelligence officer, her voice tight. "We believe they are using physical couriers, handwritten notes. We have intercepted 3. They are not in any language we have cataloged." "Translate them." "We cannot, Commander. They appear to be in codes, hand-built ciphers, each one different. We would need the key, and the keys are in their heads." Vextel stared at her. In 9,000 years of conquest, the coalition had never encountered a species that deliberately created languages they could not read. "Send down the pacification forces," he ordered. 3 legions, take their secondary cities. I want a human leader brought before me by the next solar cycle." The drop pods descended like falling stars over Berlin, Sydney, Sao Paulo, Karachi, Toronto. The Vorethi pacification forces were the most feared shock troops in the known galaxy, 2-meter-tall warriors in mirrored battle plating, armed with plasma lances that could vaporize a tank. They expected to find a panicked population fleeing before them. They found empty streets. They found schools that had been evacuated with surgical precision. They found warehouses stripped of every useful item down to the copper wiring. And then in Berlin, on a quiet boulevard at 3:47 in the afternoon, the lead element of the 9th Pacification Legion, 240 veteran warriors, walked into a kill box that had been prepared by a 68-year-old retired demolitions engineer named Wilhelm and 4 teenagers who had watched videos about the French resistance. The buildings on either side of the street collapsed simultaneously. The fuel trucks parked at the intersections detonated. By the time the smoke cleared, 193 Vorethi warriors were dead. The remaining 47 were captured. Wilhelm lost 3 of his teenagers. He carried their bodies out himself. That night, on the Sovereign of 9 Suns, Vextel Wren received the first casualty report of the Earth campaign. And on the surface, Captain Marcus Hale, Patricia's nephew, a former Army Ranger now leading the North American resistance, looked at his own list of dead, and he did not weep. He smiled. It was a smile that, had Vextel seen it, would have ended his sleep for the rest of his life. The Vorethi had a saying ancient as their first conquests: a subjugated species mourns, a defeated species pleads, a dead species is silent. There was no saying for a species that laughed. 3 weeks into the invasion, in the smoking ruins of what had once been a logistics depot in the Sahara, a Vorethi quartermaster named Threvik regained consciousness to find himself bound to a chair with what the humans called duct tape. His weapon was gone, his armor was gone, his translator implant, mercifully, was still functioning. A man stood across from him in the lantern light, mid-40s, sun-darkened skin, a scar across his left cheek that suggested it had been opened and closed several times across a lifetime. He was eating an apple. "Hello, Threvik." The Vorethi froze. The human knew his name. "My name is Marcus Hale. I'd like to talk to you about supply lines." "I will tell you nothing," Threvik hissed, in the proudest tradition of his warrior caste. "Do your worst, vermin. Your tortures cannot break a son of the Coalition." Marcus took another bite of his apple. He chewed thoughtfully. He swallowed. "Threvik," he said quietly, "I'm not going to torture you." The Vorethi blinked. "Torture is something you do when you don't have time or when you enjoy it. I don't enjoy it, and we have plenty of time." Marcus pulled up a chair, turned it backward, and sat astride it. "What I'm going to do is have a conversation with you. And during that conversation, I'm going to learn your language, not the trade tongue your translator uses, your real language, the one your mother sang to you in, the one your warriors curse in, the one with the words that aren't in your translator's dictionary." He smiled. "And once I learn your language, Threvik, I'm going to learn the names of everyone you've ever loved. And then I'm going to broadcast a message in your own voice to every Vorethi vessel in this solar system, telling them exactly where each of those people lives." Threvik stared at him. You would not, even your kind would not." "My kind," Marcus said, and his voice did not rise, did not waver, did not contain a single tremor of malice, "buried 400 million people 2 weeks ago. My aunt's son is among them. He was 11. His name was David. He liked dinosaurs and a video game called Minecraft, and he was afraid of thunderstorms." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Threvik, what was the name of your 11-year-old, because I'm going to learn it, and if you don't talk to me, if you make me work for every scrap of intelligence I need, then you will know, in your final moments, that I learned it specifically so that I could speak it aloud as the missile I'm sending finds your home." Threvik talked. He talked for 9 hours. By the time the sun rose over the dunes, Marcus Hale had a complete map of the Vorethi orbital supply network, every fuel depot, every ammunition cache, every command relay. He had the daily rotation of patrol patterns. He had the names of the 17 highest-ranking officers aboard the Sovereign of 9 Suns. And he had something else, something he had not asked for. Threvik, broken and weeping, had told him about the Coalition's central weakness, a fold space communication relay in the asteroid belt, a single point through which all Vorethi command traffic passed. Destroying it would isolate the Earth fleet. They would be alone, cut off. Marcus did not kill Threvik. He let him go. He marched him to the edge of the Vorethi perimeter and sent him back to his commanders with a single message written in plasma burn across his armored chest plate. "We are coming." When Threvik staggered into the Vorethi forward base and collapsed, when the message was translated and relayed up the chain, when it finally reached the Sovereign of 9 Suns on a quiet Vorethi morning, Commander Vextal Wren felt that strange, nameless sensation again. This time, his second-in-command, Karzan Vale, was the one who named it. Karzan stood very still, reading the report. His mandibles trembled. "Commander," he said very quietly, I believe this is the emotion the humans call fear." Vextal turned to him slowly. "And what is it that they are feeling, Karzan, the humans? Have we a name for that?" Karzan lowered his eyes. "I do not believe they have given it a name yet, Commander. I do not believe they need to." Researcher Sashin had not been bred for war. He was a Vorethi scholar of the third caste, a xenoanthropologist whose life's work was the documentation of dying species. He had catalogued the final days of 17 civilizations. He had recorded the last songs of the Heliox. He had stood in the silent libraries of the penumbral cities and watched the dust settle on books no eyes would ever read again. He took no joy in it, but he believed, in the quiet way of scholars, that someone had to remember. When the orders came to begin the Earth Archive, Sashin descended to the surface with a containment team and 3 drone librarians. He was given clearance to enter what remained of the major human data repositories. He was told to compile a summary of human civilization for the Imperial Archive before the species is fully harvested. He began with their history. He intended to spend a week on it. He spent 3. What he read, he could not unread. He read about a place called Verdun, where 2 human nations had thrown 1 million of their own young men into a meat grinder for 10 months over a single hill. The hill had no strategic value. They had fought for it anyway, because retreating would have meant the dead had died for nothing, and humans, Sashin learned, would commit any further atrocity rather than accept that their dead had died for nothing. He read about a place called Stalingrad. He read about a city where humans had eaten their own dead to keep fighting, where snipers had hunted one another through frozen ruins for months, where a single woman named Lyudmila had killed 309 enemy soldiers with a rifle and a patience that Sashin could not comprehend. He read about a man named Shackleton, who had led 27 men across the most lethal environment on their planet for 2 years and lost not a single one. He read about a child named Anne, who had hidden in an attic for 2 years and written, in her diary, that she still believed people were good at heart. He read what had been done to her and to 6 million others like her, and he read what her people, Sashin noted, her actual surviving people, had done in response and what they had built afterward, and how they had hunted the perpetrators across decades and continents and into hiding, one by one, for the rest of their lives. He read about a species that, when their children were threatened, became something for which the Vorethi language had no word. He read about a species that did not stop, that did not, in any meaningful evolutionary sense, understand how to stop. He read about a species that had developed nuclear weapons in 1945 and had not used them again. Not because they could not, because they had collectively, after seeing what they had done, chosen not to. And then he read about how that same species had spent the next 80 years preparing to use them anyway, in case their neighbors made them, and how this terrible, paradoxical restraint, this willingness to hold an apocalyptic blade to the throat of all life rather than yield, had produced peace. A peace built on the understanding that humans, if cornered, would absolutely end the world. Sashin put down his data slate. His hands were shaking. He spent that night composing a message to Commander Vextal Wren. He wrote it in the formal scholar's script, with the proper deference, with the careful hedges of a third-caste researcher addressing his commander. The message contained 1 substantive paragraph. Commander, I have studied this species. I beg you, by the bones of our ancestors, to withdraw the fleet. Withdraw now, withdraw tonight. We have not invaded a planet. We have invaded a furnace, and we have just thrown ourselves into it. They do not surrender. They have never in their recorded history ultimately surrendered. They lose and they lose and they lose, and then one day they do not lose, and on that day they do things that the universe will spend 1,000 years trying to forget. Withdraw, Commander, please, while we still can. He transmitted it at 0400 ship time. He was arrested at 0411 for sedition. He was executed at 0630 in the central hangar, before an assembly of officers, as an example of what cowardice looked like in the face of agricultural vermin. His body was incinerated, his research was sealed. 6 hours later, the human attack on the asteroid belt relay began. The relay station Vethkor 9 hung in the asteroid belt like a black orchid, a kilometer-wide bloom of crystalline antennae that channeled fold space communications across the Vorethi war effort. Its garrison was 3,000 strong. Its defensive grid had been designed to withstand a direct assault by a frontline cruiser fleet. It had never, in 2 centuries of service, taken a single scratch. The humans came at it in 17 converted civilian spacecraft. Vextal Wren, watching the engagement on the bridge of the Sovereign of 9 Suns, nearly laughed when the alert came in. Repurposed cargo haulers, mining vessels, a retrofitted asteroid surveyor that, according to the database, had been built in the year 2031. They are insane, he said. They are something, Curzon Vale murmured, and did not elaborate. The humans had been busy in the 90 days since the invasion began. They had reverse-engineered the wreckage of 3 Vorethi shuttles shot down over Eastern Europe. They had stolen, with surgical precision, a complete plasmalance assembly from a forward depot in the Pacific. They had captured alive a Vorethi engineering officer named Thuln, a quiet, terrified specialist who had broken in 11 hours and spent the following 6 weeks working for the humans with the haunted, grateful efficiency of a man who had decided, somewhere in the small hours of his interrogation, that his species deserved what was coming. Earth had not built copies of Vorethi technology. Earth had built improvements. The first Vorethi gunner aboard Vethkor 9 to fire on the incoming human flotilla saw his plasma bolt strike the lead ship's forward shielding and bend. The bolt curved, redirected by some kind of magnetic deflection field the Coalition had never encountered, and slammed back into the orbital station's own outer hull. The gunner had time to whisper one prayer before his section decompressed. The human fleet's 17 ramshackle ships coordinated their fire in patterns the Vorethi tactical computers could not predict because the patterns were not computer-generated. They were being called in real time by a 41-year-old former chess grandmaster named Anna Volkova, who had memorized every recorded Vorethi engagement and was now improvising against them with the same sleepless focus she had once brought to championship matches. She was eating sunflower seeds. She was humming. The relay station broke open like a fruit. Inside, 3,000 Vorethi warriors discovered what humans were like in close-quarters boarding actions, discovered what humans were like with shotguns at corridor distances, discovered what humans were like when they had spent 90 days reading the names of their dead on every channel, every hour, and had now arrived at a place where the people responsible could be reached. The boarding action lasted 6 hours. There were no Vorethi survivors. When Vethkor 9 went silent, the Vorethi communication network across the entire Earth campaign collapsed. Every ship in orbit was suddenly isolated, cut off from Coalition command, unable to call for reinforcement, unable to coordinate retreat, unable to do anything except face the dawning realization that the agricultural vermin below had just performed a feat of military engineering that the Coalition's own academies would have called impossible. On the Sovereign of 9 Suns, Commander Vextal Wren stood very still on the command deck. A junior officer, young, frightened, perhaps unaware of what he was saying, turned to him and asked, "Commander, what are your orders?" Vextal opened his mouth. He realized in a moment of cold clarity that he did not have any. For 9,000 years, the Coalition had operated on a single doctrine: overwhelming force, applied early, ensures rapid capitulation. The doctrine had no entry for what to do when the prey adapts faster than you can react. The doctrine had no entry for what to do when an unknown species reverse engineers your weapons in a quarter year and improves them. The doctrine assumed at its core that the Coalition was the apex. The doctrine had never imagined a predator above the Coalition. Vextal turned to Karzan Vale. "Open a channel to the surface," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I wish to discuss terms." Karzan stared at him for a long, long moment. "Commander," he said, "I do not believe they will accept a parley." "Why not?" Karzan gestured to the tactical display. The 17 human ships, now reinforced by 40 more rising from Earth's atmosphere, were no longer engaging the orbital outposts. They were forming up. They were moving toward the Sovereign of 9 Suns. "Because," Karzan said, "I do not believe they came to negotiate, Commander. I believe they came to finish." The Sovereign of 9 Suns was the largest warship in the Coalition fleet, a 6-kilometer leviathan of black alloy and coiled plasma, a vessel that had broken planets, that had ended civilizations, that bore the ceremonial scars of 240 victories etched into its prow. Captain Marcus Hale stepped into its docking bay at 02:17 GMT, leading a boarding party of 312 humans, and he carried in his left hand a list. The list was 47 pages long. It contained the names of every Vorethi officer currently aboard the flagship, in order of rank. It also contained, for each name, the rough estimate of how many human dead each officer was responsible for. Marcus had compiled it personally over the course of 90 days. He had checked it twice. "Comms," he said quietly into his throat mic, "begin broadcast." Across every internal Vorethi channel on the ship, a human voice, calm, female, multilingual, began reading. Not battle commands, not surrender demands. Names. The names of the 400 million human dead from the first day of the bombardment. The names of the 11 million more who had died in the 90 days since. The names rolled through the Sovereign of 9 Suns in a slow, relentless tide, and the Vorethi warriors who heard it, the elite of the elite, the children of the conqueror caste, warriors who had never in their lives been afraid, began, for the first time in their species' recorded history, to weep. They did not know why. They could not have articulated in their language why a list of names from a species they had been told was vermin was reaching into their chests and squeezing their hearts. They had been raised on a doctrine that said other beings were less. The doctrine had not prepared them for the simple, terrible weight of hearing how many of the less there had been. Of hearing how each of those names had been a mother, a son, a child who liked dinosaurs, a medical resident, a fisherman, a 6-year-old girl named Sofia in Buenos Aires. The names did not stop. The names would not stop. And in the corridors of the great flagship, the boarding action began. It was nothing like the propaganda hollows. The humans did not roar, they did not charge. They moved through the ship with the patience of hunters who had been planning this for 90 days and had no intention of dying before the work was complete. They cleared rooms in 3-person teams. They breached bulkheads with shaped charges built from materials scavenged from their own destroyed cities. They used the ship's own ventilation system against its defenders, because Thuln, the engineering officer who had broken on the 11th hour of his interrogation, had drawn them a map. Vextal Wren stood on his command deck and listened to the names. He listened as his ship died around him. He listened as the deck plates beneath his feet trembled with each new section that fell. He listened as Karzan Vale, his second-in-command, his oldest friend, drew his ceremonial blade and bowed his head and said, "Commander, permit me the honor," and then opened his own throat because he could not bear what was coming. Vextal did not stop him. When the doors to the command deck finally blew inward, Vextal was alone. He had taken off his armor, he had set down his blade. He stood in the center of the chamber in his ceremonial robes, the robes of his caste, embroidered with the names of his ancestors, names that had ruled stars for 9,000 years, and he watched the human captain step over the bodies of his honor guard and approach him. Marcus Hale stopped 3 meters away. He looked older than he should have. His hair had gone white at the temples. There was something in his eyes that Vextal had read about in Sashan's smuggled reports and had not understood until that moment. It was not hatred. It was something much worse than hatred. It was a quiet, settled, forever sort of grief, with a fire at the bottom of it that would never go out, not in this lifetime, not in any lifetime, because the people who could have put it out were not coming back. "Commander Vextal Wren," Marcus said. "Captain Hale." "You have," Marcus said very quietly, "a great deal to answer for." Vextal Wren closed his 3 eyes. "I know," he whispered. And the names kept reading, and the names kept reading, and the names did not stop. It would be remembered in the history of the galaxy as the reading. Not the boarding action, not the destruction of the Sovereign of 9 Suns, not the surrender 2 days later of the remaining 412 Vorethi vessels in Earth's orbit. Not even the swift, brutal collapse of the coalition itself in the months that followed as 140 subjugated species, suddenly miraculously informed by a quiet broadcast from a small blue world, rose simultaneously and tore their conquerors apart. It would be remembered as the reading, the 41-day broadcast, the voices in every human language speaking the names of the dead. Because the broadcast had not stopped when the Sovereign fell, it had continued, it had grown. It had been picked up by every Vorethi communication relay the humans captured, then by every coalition outpost that the rising species seized, then by every world that had ever lost its own dead to coalition fire, and now finally had the courage to speak them aloud. The reading lasted 473 days by Earth's calendar before the last name, a Heliox child whose parents had carried her name across 2 centuries of slavery, was finally spoken into the void. When it ended, the galaxy was a different place. The Terran Council convened for the first time on the anniversary of the invasion, in a hall built from the recovered hull plating of the Sovereign of 9 Suns. The hall had no throne. The humans, after long debate, had decided against thrones. They had also decided against a flag and a hymn, and most of the trappings that other species used to mark their ascendancy. They had kept only one ceremonial element. Along the eastern wall of the hall, in letters of black iron, were written 411 million names. The wall was not finished. It would not be finished for decades. New names were added every day as forensic teams continued to recover remains from the irradiated craters that had once been cities. The humans had decided collectively that no one would be forgotten, that every single person taken from them would be named and would be remembered and would matter. The Vorethi ambassador, a trembling third-caste scholar named Thren, one of the few survivors of the fallen empire, stood before the council on the day of its first session. She had been chosen for her caste and for the fact that she had once been an apprentice to a researcher named Sashin, whose final smuggled writings she still carried, folded against her hearts. She had come to deliver her people's surrender. Her people no longer existed as an empire. Her people were scattered, hunted, broken across 100 worlds. She had come to ask on their behalf for mercy. She stood before the human council in silence, unable to speak, her 3 eyes fixed on the wall of names. A human rose to address her. It was Patricia Hale, former general, current speaker of the council. She was 61 years old now. Her hair was entirely white. She had lost a son in Tokyo and a nephew in the boarding of the Sovereign because Marcus had not survived his final assault. She walked with a cane. Her voice, when she spoke, was very calm. "Ambassador Thren," she said, "we have read the documents your researcher Sashin wrote before your commander killed him. We have read his warnings. We agree with his assessment of our species. We are not proud of it. We are not ashamed of it. We are simply, finally, honest about it." She paused. "You came here expecting us to demand reparations, or genocide, or surrender of your remaining worlds. We will not be doing any of those things. You will go home, ambassador. Your people will rebuild. We will not pursue you." Thren's mandibles trembled. "Why?" she whispered. "After what we did, why?" Patricia Hale looked at the wall of names. She looked at it for a long time. "Because," she said, "we are choosing to. Every day for the rest of our species' existence, we will choose. That is the only difference between what we are and what you were. We can end you. We have decided not to." She turned back to the ambassador, and her eyes, old, gray, terrible, held Thren's gaze without pity and without mercy and without forgiveness, but with something else, something for which the Vorethi language had never developed a word. "Go home, ambassador. Tell every species you meet, on every world you pass, what we are now. Tell them that humanity has come into the stars. Tell them we will be good neighbors. Tell them we will be loyal allies. Tell them we will trade fairly and speak honestly and offer aid to any world in need." She leaned forward on her cane. "And tell them, ambassador, tell them very clearly that they must never, ever make us read the names again." Thren left the chamber that day, and she carried the message across the galaxy, and the galaxy listened. 10,000 years later, it was listening still.